talking to you today about, I'm going to talk and focus mainly on humanitarian accountability. And I'm talking at a time where I'm kind of feeling a little like pulled in two different directions. And I think you'll get that theme as I talk to you today. On one hand, I have a real sense of kind of optimism at the moment about the sort of changes in the sector, what can be achieved, and that the kind of the status quo of what we've built to date can't hold, and that there is a sort of a better way. People are really struggling with some of the challenges around how do we flip a system on its head to be more accountable to affected people, and a real sense of growing commitment from all levels of all organizations, from the new UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, who's put accountability to affected people at the top of his agenda, to organizations who are really trying to grapple with this, and a real sense of there is a momentum and we can't continue doing what we've always done in the same way. And at the same time, with that momentum and with all of those tools there and with all of the commitment, things are not happening in the way that we want to see things change. And there's this constant pullback to kind of how things have always been set up, and we're not managing to put all the pieces there to really be able to kind of galvanize this momentum. So I kind of want to put that to you, of this kind of conundrum of, on one hand, some fantastic new ways of doing things, really trying to move ahead, and yet we can't seem to shift the system around to make those changes. So I'll just share with you sort of what I feel are some of the areas where some of the challenges that are there, some of what is the positive solutions or changes that I'm seeing happening, and then kind of reflect and ask for your ideas as well on kind of some of the conundrums of how we could change things. Just to kind of situate us as all, I'm sure, for this crowd that we're speaking to today and gathered here, you've probably got other definitions of what accountability means. If you have got other ones that you feel are good, please again share them with us. But this is the one that we use at the CHS Alliance, the Core Humanitarian Standard Alliance. And I like it because it has this sense of sort of that accountability is about how we use power and using it responsibly, and ultimately kind of how we use it for those that are affected by our work. And again, if this sort of anything in there sort of resonates with you or doesn't feel right, or you've got a better definition of accountability, we'd really like to hear it, because I think it really gets pulled apart what we mean by accountability to affected people. But for us, it really is about this idea of being connected to kind of power and responsibility. So, as I said, I'm going to share with you what I feel are some of the challenges to the humanitarian system being more accountable to the people that it exists to serve, some of those positive movements, and then ask you for your ideas about some of the conundrums of how we can make change. And I'm going to do this through two different lenses. One is around organizational accountability, and the other one is around system change for accountability, very much reflecting on this idea of the broader humanitarian governance. So I'm going to start with organizations, because that's really at the basis of what the core humanitarian standard kind of functions at. The CHS is, now let me first say the idea, like if organizations set up, the idea of organizations being accountable to those they serve isn't new. But my perception is that it hasn't created, even though we've been talking about accountability to affected people for quite some time, we haven't seen the kind of systematic change within our organizations that we wanted to. And in some ways, and again, these are reflections, some of that is we've seen it too much as a kind of a programmatic add-on. It was about doing surveys. It was about building in how do you listen to people through how you build your programs. It was then about putting in complaint boxes and feedback mechanisms, and it was doing sort of final program evaluations. But I think what's beginning to shift now, or what there really is a realization around, is that it can't be seen as a programmatic activity, but it has to be built into how the whole organization functions. We have John Beverley has joined us today, and he's the treasurer of the CHS Alliance. So he'll get this analogy, which I've used a number of times, and that is how do we use the analogy of how organizations take their understanding and their roles as for financial accountability, and how could we build in systems that mirror that level of scrutiny and attention that we've given to how we manage and look after our finances as we do to the people we serve. So in organizations, we're all used to being able to fill out the right forms whenever we're dealing with money. We'll have financial policies in place that guide how you use those monies. There'll be finance departments. We'll have a chief financial officer. Our boards will have, if you're lucky, a great John Beverley treasurer who will keep us on track of how the money is being spent. And we've built whole systems around the whole organization, right down to kind of the programmatic side, right through to the governance around financial accountability. And yet we have not done the same at all in terms of when we're talking about our accountability to the very people that we serve. And so how do we kind of create that same level of building in right from the programmatic right up to our governing boards to be able to have a look at that level of accountability? So I did say I would want to give you some kind of solutions and not just putting out the challenges. And obviously, as I'm coming from the Core Humanitarian Standard Alliance, one of the solutions that we feel is part of a solution to this is the Core Humanitarian Standard. So this is what I'm hoping you've all maybe taken a glance and looked or know the Core Humanitarian Standard. But in brief, what it is, or the essence of it is a set of commitments, 9 commitments that the sector, the whole sector, has made to the people it serves. And the premise of that is that by knowing what to expect, people themselves can hold organizations to account. And what else around the CHS is, well, it is these sort of 9 commitments, which are fairly broad, fairly wide-ranging, fairly all-encompassing. What we've got behind these 9 commitments is a set of 62 indicators. And this is really important because those indicators have been set up so that they can be measurable. And the idea behind this is that if we're making a set of commitments to people affected, that isn't good enough anymore just to say we can meet them and that we want to be able to meet them. We actually, as organizations, have to kind of measure how we're meeting those commitments. We need to be able to look at it, how the whole organization is making those changes, and obviously make the improvements where it's weak. The process of verification, without getting out of it, I'm very happy to answer any of your questions around this, but the process of verification really does take this whole of organizational approach. So it does look at all of the policies that have been signed off by governing boards. It does look at the role of senior management in implementing those policies. It does go to the countries and checks that staff know and are implementing those policies. It does check with the partners whether they feel those policies are being implemented in the right way. And really importantly, it goes to the communities. We go and talk to people who are being served to see if any of that is making a difference to how they're feeling they are being treated and getting the attention or assistance or protection that they need. So this is, and from that, we are able to actually measure and see how organizations do meet their commitments. And what we see is organizations are not, even though you can say those 9 commitments are fairly generic, what we see is organizations are really struggling to meet some of these commitments. The only commitment that is almost being met, and are met on this sort of, for those of you who are into your data and your research, being met is a 3, is the one around coordination. The most stark and always the weakness in this is one around how we welcome complaints and how we're listening and giving feedback from communities. So number 5 and number 4 always have challenges for organizations. And what this means, if we, apart from it just being a challenge, is organizations have to really then be able to make a heavy series of improvements in a quite a limited time frame in 2 years to be able to continue being kind of audited and meet their certificate of compliance against the CHS. So that's one of the approaches that is, we feel, having a difference in terms of creating organizational accountability for affected people. A solid standard that is being agreed by the sector, and a process of organizations measuring themselves and making institutional improvements to meet that. The challenge for us to think about is we have 130 organizations right now who've gone through this process. We had a little bit of a victory when we got past the 100 mark. We feel that 130 means we've got some good foundations. This is starting to be built on. There's a heavy level of commitment to this. Organizations are invested in it, but 130 doesn't make the sea change that we need to see. We need to be able to get this to a mass. We need to get this normalized. We need to get this being the actual kind of norm of how you, as an organization that has been given resources to protect and work with vulnerable people, you have to be able to show that you're meeting this standard. And we need to be able to get that to scale. And so the challenge is how do we do that? And that's what I'd like you to kind of reflect on. From an alliance perspective, we have these debates, and we are constantly working with government donors to push government donors to say, if you really want organizations to be able to uphold these standards, you've got the power, you can drive this, you need to demand this of your organizations. That's one approach. We also need the organizations themselves to take this up, as many of the 130 who have done, because they believe it's the right thing to do. We also, though, have to build in the incentives for organizations to do this. It can't just be a club of organizations who want this to be done. It has to be seen as the norm, and we need to get more and more organizations wanting to be able to show that they're meeting this standard. So this gets into where the tensions are around what's the incentives. Yes, you improve, you do better programming, but where does that get kind of recognized? Where are the drivers for this change? In the coming 2 years, and this is where it starts to get very exciting, is we're going to revise the standard. And in that revision of the standard, what we hope to do is be able to make it, not get rid of anything. It's a pretty robust standard. We don't want to throw anything out, but we want to really emphasize that piece around it being core. The idea of a core humanitarian standard that is non-negotiable, that everybody does recognize they have to be able to meet the criteria that is set up in that standard, so we can get to that mass of influence for organizations to be able to meet it. So really welcome, think about that, share ideas, or let's come back to that discussion of how and what is the right way that we can get to that massive to change. And so that brings me then on to what the sort of systematic beyond the CHS, one of the approaches of getting change is getting to that massive organizations. But then I also want to talk to you a little just to finish off, which is, what does this idea of systematic accountability or collective accountability mean? And if I can just go to, and I think for one of the areas that we need to reflect on together when we're talking about humanitarian governance, when we're talking about humanitarian accountability, is the humanitarian system was built, rightfully so in many ways, that it had to be fast, it had to be efficient, it had to bring people in from outside, it responded, it left, it moved on to the next crisis. The very essence of accountability to the people we served has really been it's been there, but it wasn't built into it wasn't there sort of 20 years ago. It wasn't built in. What was built in, as many of you know, and Taya has written about this, which is around the humanitarian principles. And is there this conflict between where the sort of impartiality and the independence created a system that is at odds with the idea of being accountable to the people that we serve? So this is where it gets into this kind of the conundrum, that other pull, which is we are trying to change a system that was built in a very different way, the humanitarian side, to what we have now, which is we're trying to turn that around to really say this has to be grounded on individual people, their needs, their rights, and their dignity. So the reasons why, the sort of challenges of why we need to do that is, obviously, if we are serious about taking a people-centered approach, then we really need this idea of being coordinated around the people as opposed to the organizations, which was where and how it was built. And how do we start to pull the pieces of where we feel the changes need to be made into a coordinated system? And again, onto the kind of the positives of that, there is a growing momentum now, or a discourse around the term collective accountability. The NGOs are grappling with what would it mean for us to really be accountable together at a country level, and what are we going to hold ourselves accountable to? The UN agencies, the humanitarian UN agencies, are constantly now talking about collective accountability. The interagency standing committee, the coordination mechanisms that are set up, are really grappling with what does collective accountability mean. The challenge right now is it's still a concept as opposed to a reality of what we actually all understand by that. And I think it's a really fascinating discourse that is happening to be able to consider what that collective accountability would mean. What we are seeing is some initiatives which we've been heavily involved with at the CHS, working with the UN around what we're calling a collective accountability tracker, which would try and look and ask the humanitarian country teams, the clusters, to measure themselves around how they're meeting the CHS commitments as a collective. It's one approach. It's not the answer, it's not the magic bullet, but it's definitely a good approach that starts to build a consensus and a consistency around these commitments to affected people, and then as a means of kind of actually being able to measure how we're meeting them. As I said, we do have there is a strong consensus among the UN agencies right from the top, with Martin Griffiths, the new emergency relief coordinator, putting accountability to affected people at the top of his agenda. However, again, how do we take that rhetoric and turn it into the reality is the challenge. I think there's some good examples happening. A couple is where we're seeing work that particularly an organization called Ground Truth Solutions have been working on, where they're rigorously measuring what the views of people's affected voices are. And we've been working with them to see how that aligns to the CHS. And then we've been taking it to the humanitarian teams to say, you need to change and adapt your plans based on this feedback. And where we've been able to work, and it's been very time intensive, it's been very resource intensive to be able to look at how you actually change your collective plans based on the views of affected people, based on the CHS commitments. The challenge, again, kind of putting out there is it was so time intensive and took other organizational resources and donor money. How do we build that in so it's systematically happening without this sort of heavy outside influence to create that change? I think another good positive example that's out there is the work that we've seen around cash, the use of cash in humanitarian response. If we look again 20 years ago, cash was a bit of a sort of a strange oddity. It wasn't mainstreamed. It was sort of this outside niche. I think now the coordination around cash is really starting to kind of create a change and a more normalized way of doing things. And I think we need to learn a little and stay close to how the cash work has helped. I also think that there's an interesting work that we're doing with TEA and the ISS and the Netherlands government right now, which is around a project to say what would it take to close the accountability gap for survivors and victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. And the interesting thing, and I think myself and TEA, this is what's excited us about this project, apart from trying to look at this challenge of what that accountability means to the people themselves, is it's trying to push outside of the humanitarian boundaries. It's trying to look at how does this fit within a justice system? How does this fit with national ombudsmen? How does it fit in a human rights discourse? And I think we need to, it's in its fledgling, this project, but again, trying to get us out of our humanitarian world, again, which was built on this machine-like approach to try and get us to a different way of doing things. The other conundrum, just to throw out there, another conundrum that we think about is the idea of the humanitarian ombudsman or a sort of meta watchdog. That discourse, that kind of gut reaction that there needs to be something else, there has to be another oversight body, constantly comes up in discussions, and we haven't found the solution to what that looks like yet, but we need to keep considering about what outside influence do we have to be more accountable to affected people. And I'm sure you've all got some good ideas on that one. And then just so finally, I think going back to kind of my initial sort of feeling of being pulled by this sort of, the pieces of the puzzle are there. The momentum is challenging because we sort of need to rebuild. We've got these different pieces and we need to put them together in a more connected way to try and kind of reinvent the system to make it more than the sum of the parts right now. So I hope that gives you some just overview thoughts really from myself about where I see some of the momentum around humanitarian accountability right now, as well as sort of where the challenges and the blockages are for being able to build it in a new way, which would love to get your views and ideas on around sort of humanitarian governance and how we can unblock. Thanks, Taya.
Great, Tanya, thank you so much. We have a habit in our humanitarian governance webinar that we start off with somebody giving a few comments and questions, and they will be brief and short, and then we will open up for the floor for discussion. In the meantime, Tanya can, I know she's a multitasker, maybe browse a little bit through the chats, and then we will open up. We will also bring back some questions that I've seen coming up in the chat. Gabi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thea. Thank you, Tanya, for this very, I would say interesting, but I don't want to use again interesting because everybody says it's interesting, but it actually gives us many ideas to think about. And I won't take much time because I want the audience to actually answer the question that you posed in your presentation about how to improve, how to take the opportunity of this momentum for accountability. So I just want to say that the questions that you are actually presenting today are the questions that we have in our project as a humanitarian governance team, trying to unveil these issues of accountability. So I think we can all be in the same page with you. And we appreciate very much that you bring this into the discussion and make us, as a collective, to think about these challenges. I really like the way in which you say, okay, I am doing this presentation in two ways, in two directions. And I would take the side of the optimism, because all of the people that are here maybe are more identified with the not so optimistic part, right? We all know the problems. We all know that the system is so difficult to change, but let's maybe focus on the positive. So I was wondering, I was reading this report for my own research. I was reading the Humanitarian Accountability Report and all these indicators that you shared at the beginning of your presentation. Maybe just for us to be more optimistic, how do you see, or maybe you can share some good examples that you've seen in the practice or from organizations that are actually committed in terms of how to better address the feedback from affected populations, which is one of the indicators that is not having a good performance, right? So are there good practices, good lessons that you've seen? Okay, this is also a struggle, but we also have positive practices. Could you share something nice about it? And thank you so much for the presentation.
No, thank you. Thanks for that, and always good to focus on the optimistic, good change stuff. I think a couple of examples just to keep it practical that I feel have been a success. If we take those indicators of measurement, behind all of those are organizations who've had to make substantial changes under a lot of pressure to do better. If you do read, and maybe if you can share it if you haven't, the last Humanitarian Accountability Report, what we've tried to put in there is what we've called stories of change, which were where the organizations have had to really make substantial changes. One that I feel was it was early on in the CHS, but I take this as, I think it was, and Taya was on our board at the time. I don't know if she remembers this one, but it was CAFOD, who actually got their certificate suspended because they hadn't made the changes enough and fast enough on their certification. This was a Catholic agency when we were at the height of the safeguarding scandals in the sector. There was a lot of media about it, got picked up in the media. They were also under some of their own scrutiny. And they had to make and it was quite sensitive what their challenges were, which was on their complaint handling system. And they had to really do some fast work to kind of really rehaul right from the top down to how they were basically handling their complaints, which frankly wasn't good enough. And they had to make those changes fast. And they, now they really will say that changed kind of the culture in the organization of how they were picking up those responses. That's the kind of, it was a bit of a nervous part because we had to sort of do a quick indraw of breath of what this would mean for a large organization, which took a lot of sort of publicity to continue with the system of creating that change. Just one last example, which gives it from another perspective, which we've seen, and I think this is really important because it gets to the heart of the CHS, which is a really basic, which is telling organizations, going to communities, and this is something the CHS looks at, and just going to people and saying, has anyone ever actually told you what behavior you can expect from these aid workers coming in? And this was from one organization that we were auditing. And it was quite challenging that nobody had ever said, when somebody comes, you do not put them up in your house overnight. That is not okay. They cannot stay there. Like really just the basic levels. And another part connected to that, and it's a simple one, but drives me crazy is around photographs as well. How we take photographs, who we're taking photographs of, and the CHS has picked up on that within organizations, making sure there's a proper signed off commitment to who you're taking photographs of and how you're using those. These are smaller things which are about the sort of practice, but actually make a huge difference to people, and how we're considering the people that we're working with.
Great, thank you. That gives really some flesh to the stories. This is really great. Gabi, was that your question? Shall I open up now?
Yes, just wanted to say that this was maybe the fourth point that you could add to the list that you said, okay, we're working with donors, we are committing organizations, and we are gonna revise or review the standards. Maybe the fourth one could be this, take the feedback from affected populations into this momentum would be kind of interesting too. Thank you.